Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 19 of Truth is Justice. This episode is going to be a little different from our usual focus on the false and misleading statements. We're almost 5 months in, and after demonstrating week after week how shows like Bob's can be questioned from so many different angles, we wanted to address what we think is a huge problem in the way these shows operate. We wanted to highlight what we think is a clear ability for these shows to operate virtually without restriction and without any oversight, and how that free rein can be quite easily used to provide an advantage for certain individuals who claim that their cases are examples of wrongful convictions. And they can do that quite easily via the manipulation of the audiences of these shows. I asked a question on a Facebook page a few days ago, and the responses were quite interesting. A summary of the question was, would it be justified to make untruthful statements and fabricate claims if you were trying to focus attention on a particular case that you were passionate about and that you believed in the person's innocence? Now, I'll expand on the example a little bit further to put it in context, because I think the underlying message that comes from it, the consequences, are actually far-reaching and they need to be addressed. Say I know someone, and we'll give him the name John Smith, and John has been charged with a brutal crime, a murder. And John's in a low socioeconomic group and would in many respects represent a perfect person to pin this crime on, if you believe that law enforcement generally actively operates with that mindset. So say that I completely believe in John's innocence for various reasons. And I'm not his legal counsel, I'm just a friend of his who has heard his side of the story. I'm aware that John's circumstances means that it's exceedingly difficult for him to obtain suitable defence counsel, both because of his financial means and because the case simply would not have been attractive to counsel, because from a brief look at it, John perhaps to many looked wholly guilty of committing the crime. And remember, this example works during either the pre-conviction or post-conviction phase. So as a friend of John's, what if I could generate public awareness of his case in such a way that would allow John to gather supporters and raise funds to enable him to afford a better defence counsel? Now, I know that everyone is entitled to a legal defence, well, everyone in most circumstances in most developed nations in the world, but there's an obvious difference in the quality of defence teams. Would John stand a better chance with the best defence team in the country and all of their resources, or a newly graduated public defender working on his first case as lead? Of course the former. Now, not being critical of the newly graduated public defender working on his first case as lead, but the experience, knowledge, talent and resources that could be called upon by a dream team of lawyers is going to be more helpful to John 100 times out of 100. So, how to go about generating public awareness of the case? Now, if you stick to the script, the facts of the case, it would probably be exceedingly hard. Like I highlighted, John looks guilty. Convincing people to get behind his case in support of him would be difficult, if not impossible. You may get one or two, but it wouldn't generally help him. Now, what if the truth was stretched a little? What if some claims were made up to try and attract attention to his case? What if I took a topical issue in society at the time and applied that to the case? Suddenly, it starts becoming possible to get people behind his case. Say John's case was being considered in an area that had had a history of poor treatment of marginal groups, and over the past 15 years a number of officers working in that very office that was handling John's case had faced some type of disciplinary proceeding or had been sacked. Now, John has never suggested anything like that happened to him, but maybe, just maybe, if a little white lie is told, I can get him some help. So I find a platform that has significant exposure, and I start telling everyone about John's poor treatment by the officers handling the case. I could go further and suggest that their treatment of John's case was entirely driven by their history of marginalisation. I mean, I could even suggest a long-term friendship between the leading officer and a number of the officers who had previously faced disciplinary proceedings or those that had been sacked. I could say that the leading officer himself, or herself, was under investigation at one point, but it never went further. I could just say that that was because the office didn't want any more bad press, not because they were innocent of it. Now, you might be starting to see how I could build support for John. Now, quite obviously I'm not a marketer, but I can see how this could be quite effectively developed. With someone skilled in marketing and with a number of people outspoken on the relevant community issue and a platform to share those stories, over a short time, John's case could be raised from one of obscurity to one of a man falsely accused of a crime by a group of tunnel-visioned and corrupt law enforcement officials who were simply looking to pin a case on a man that easily fits the profile. Now, it all sounds good, right, for people like me who are in support of John. With the increased media attention and public support, I can start a fundraising campaign, and we can attract the attention of a powerful defence team to properly represent John. Importantly, at this point, the facts don't matter. I can pretty much make them up, because that isn't the story. The story is how poorly treated John was, and I can paint that story in whatever way I want. I am under no obligations to tell the full story, or to be accurate in the parts of the story that I do tell. I have no real concerns about the consequences of the stories I've told about the officers. Now, sure, some of them would no doubt be upset with me, but really, would any take action against me? No, probably not. If they did, the first element of that would likely just be a retraction, and that would come a long, long way down the road, long after John has received his funds for his defence, and long after the damage of those comments was made. For me, and for John and his family, no harm has been caused. Now, I'll interrupt this story briefly to say that I'm not suggesting that every case portrayed by the media is portrayed in this way. Absolutely not. I'm describing how easy it would be to achieve this for a given case if you so wished, and how the consequences of doing so are almost exclusively positive for John. By that I mean, think about what the potential negative consequences for John would be. And I'd argue there are very, very few, and they are vastly outweighed by the positives. And I'll cover that more in a little bit. So, I've gathered public support for John, we've completed a fundraiser which has attracted funds for him and allowed him to engage a formidable defence team. And importantly, at this point, John hasn't had to be involved at all in any of this. Neither has his defence team. This could all be done by me in complete isolation. It could also be achieved with his family members as support, and that would add some serious credibility to the story, especially if they were happy to offer up the same claims that I made about corruption by law enforcement, etc. Now, imagine family members speaking publicly about the treatment that John has received, and even the treatment that they've received at the hands of those very same law enforcement officials. It could very easily be framed as a group of law enforcement officials picking on John because of who he was and who his family was, where he lived and how he dressed and how much money he made. And in the right climate of community unease and with the right marketing, it would be powerful. So the obvious question might be, what if all of this falls apart? What if the stories are exposed for what they were, lies, or stretches of the truth? Remember again, John hasn't had to be involved at all. So not one single thing that I've said needs to reflect poorly on him if it's uncovered as being wholly made up. But importantly, I don't actually think that would matter at all in the overall scheme of things. I don't think it would hit John's public support in any meaningful way, and it isn't like the funds could be clawed back. John has his defence counsel now. Now the first part, John's public support, let's look at that. If it was done well enough, and I don't think that would be that hard to do, people would be passionately in support of John and convinced that he had received poor treatment because of who he is. Would someone coming out and accusing me of lying make any difference to what those supporters thought? For the vast, vast majority, probably not. I could simply say that those people accusing me of lying are themselves lying, and they are simply defending the law enforcement officials because of some untoward connection. I could just play the same cards again. is shout out corruption and demonstrate that it now extends even further in getting outside people to challenge my claims against them. My claims of connections between the law enforcement officials involved directly in John's case and those who had disciplinary action taken against them would be very hard to disprove. Even if the people involved said there was no connection, a lot of people would simply not believe them. Would I have to offer up evidence of the connection myself? No, of course not. Many people would accept that if I made the statement, it was very likely true. Remember, they are also now supporters of John, so small suggestions can be very powerful in uniting them behind a given cause. Now, the second point of the funds. Obviously, the funds couldn't be clawed back, but even if they could be, for the reasons I've just pointed out, I don't think many people would want them to be. If anything, the challenges directed at my claims could simply be spun in such a way that even generates more attention, more supporters, and more funds. John has his defence now, so that's all that matters. Does John's defence need to use anything that I've raised? No, absolutely not. They wouldn't have to refer to or address a single thing that I've raised in support of John, in gathering his supporters for him. Most people, most of John's supporters, probably wouldn't be overly interested in what his team did formally in representing him. They would just be interested in the broader elements of the case and wanting justice for him. So, at this point of the example, you'll notice that I haven't actually had to raise any of the facts of the case, let alone debate them. But importantly, I could do that. And if I did that well, that would simply add more weight to the argument for John's innocence. I just need to be very selective in the types of material I released and the way I released it. And if I did that well enough, then you have an even more powerful case. And believe me when I say, that's going to be relatively easy to do. Now you might ask, how would that be done? Well, by focusing on what represents John's defence and attacking any aspect of the case which is focused on his prosecution. And that isn't as hard as you might imagine. Now, I can say quite confidently that if I presented the defence argument and tore apart carefully selected pieces of the prosecution case, 999 cases out of 1,000, I would be able to convince a large percentage of an audience that the person charged with the crime was innocent. And that isn't because I think I'd be doing anything special. It's just the reality that defence arguments can be very compelling. And any given prosecution argument can be, and almost necessarily is, disputed by the defence. And often that's done very well. Now, a quick story. I remember many years ago, a friend and I, and the friend is someone who doesn't work in the legal profession, we were observing a case that we had some knowledge of. And we both held the view that the defendant was guilty. There was no single piece of evidence that confirmed that belief, but it was a combination of elements. Anyway, observing the trial, it was quite powerful to see the impact that the defence's arguments at trial had on my friend's views. While still holding a view of confirmed guilt, the view was that now, because of the performance of his defence counsel, that he might actually get off. The defence was very effective. Now, as it turns out, he didn't. He was convicted, and it took the jury a relatively short time to arrive at that decision. But it is important as a reminder of just how powerful a good defence team can be. For those that have an interest in considering this argument a little more, find a case online, one that you can get access to the case materials and specifically the reporter's records, and read the opening and closing statements from the defence, not the prosecution. And by just doing that, I think you'll see how powerful a defence argument actually can be. Now, with respect to this example, extracting the very best defence arguments and using those in a way which allows the gathering together of a strong group of supporters for John would be a relatively straightforward process. Now, skip forward to trial or to a post-conviction avenue. Imagine John is found not guilty, or in a post-conviction appeal he is successful and released. Again, the way I attracted the support for John doesn't matter. In fact, less and less people would believe I used lies and fabrications, even if they were showed evidence that it was lies and fabrication. The proof, at least for them, is in the fact that John was found not guilty, or that he was released from custody. It doesn't even matter why John was found not guilty or was released from custody. It may have been a technical ruling on a point of law or something entirely unrelated to confirming John's actual innocence. But again, that doesn't matter. All his supporters will see is that John is innocent. Now, I'll stop here briefly to say, and I say this very clearly, I don't think the work that some people do to help those that have been wrongfully convicted is invalid in any way. I think it's incredible work to do, and it says a lot of amazing things about the people doing it, and deserves a huge amount of praise. But the people I have seen who do this well, who are incredibly effective, are not doing this in a way that has them shouting from the rooftops and drawing in a lot of money from doing it. It's the people doing this not for the praise or the financial benefits, they're doing it because of what is right. And there are many, many people who do this work without the fanfare. They can still be successful in helping people, arguably helping even more people because they don't bother themselves with the drama or the need to please sponsors or the need to be the centre of attention. They do it because it's the right thing to do, and they do it largely without broad recognition or praise. When I posed this question and the example, I received some very interesting responses. Some were strongly committed to the fact that lies, in whatever form, even lies viewed as just little white lies, have simply no place in this sphere. It was said that doing so is not just immoral, but draws into question the very foundations of what the justice system is about, and arguably what the basis of the rule of law is. It is manipulation of a system to achieve a particular outcome, and whether you think the outcome was right or not, it's still manipulating that system. But others weren't so sure. Some people said that because they feel that the justice system is already weighted heavily against the defendant, then fair play to the person who can gain an advantage, even if that advantage was obtained through deceit or by misleading people. And in my view, that is the serious problem. There is actually the view held, and not just by a small group of people, that it is perfectly fine to tell lies and manipulate stories in such a way as to provide the ability for someone to have their side of the story heard. Now imagine if the reverse was suggested. What if, to ensure the prosecution of someone for a particularly gruesome crime, it was necessary for a little white lie to be told or some piece of evidence to be gathered in a questionable way? All of a sudden, for many, at least in this current climate of wrongful convictions, that isn't viewed as being acceptable by many at all. It would lead to cries of corruption and would then cast doubt over every piece of work that law enforcement official has previously done and will do in the future. In fact, it would throw into question the work of their whole office. Now, what are some examples of that? Well, imagine a situation where a search warrant was backdated or manipulated in some other way. Arguably, the actual evidence is still valid, if not legally admissible. It would still tell the same story, but perhaps the only way to get the evidence at that very point in time was to go about it in the way undertaken. Now, is that the right thing to do? No, of course not. But it could be seen to be on par with the earlier examples I've given. It's only a little white lie, but you can no doubt see the problem. It was a means to an end, was thrown about as a potential way to explain and justify taking those steps for John. But in this climate, it would be difficult to present that same argument for the law enforcement official. So, what's the one big thing that this strategy for John relies on? Public exposure. It requires awareness. The more the better, and the more effectively it can work. And that previously has been quite hard. See, you go to a newspaper or television outlet and plead your argument for people to consider John's story. You could try and sell the case to the media outlet based on corruption, etc., and you could try and present the lies and manipulation in the ways that I've highlighted. But it would be unlikely to work. And why? Well, because the newspapers and television stations would fact-check that information before running with the story, and that is where it would fall apart. Yeah, if you tried to sell to these media outlets on the argument that the two officers that arrested John were best friends with the officers from the same area that was sacked for corrupt conduct several years earlier, they'll likely not take you on your word. They will likely research it. They certainly, and I say they, I mean any respected media outlet other than the most gutter of tabloid productions, they certainly wouldn't publish something on the front page, or any page for that matter, suggesting that link. And they wouldn't run a news story on a nightly news television update suggesting that link until they were absolutely sure it was true. They wouldn't even run the same story and say they don't know for sure, but it might be true. And why? Because they know that running that story in that way would have the effect of influencing some people into believing it was true. It could have no factual basis, but still, the fact that a media outlet ran with it would convince at least some people that it was factual. Now, I'm not saying you can blindly believe everything you read in newspapers or that you see on television. Of course, they don't present every single fact and they don't show every single side of a story. They're trying to sell papers and gain viewers. But there's a reasonably high standard set, again at least in the respected press, for the truth to be shared. You will not see a headline in the Houston Chronicle that reads, "Lead prosecutor and juror in conspiracy to convict accused," without there being sufficient proof to support it. They won't justify the headline by, after the headline, writing, "We don't know if there's any truth to it, but imagine if it was true. Imagine what that means for the convicted." Now, of course, there's clickbait all over the internet, and occasionally traditional media outlets employ that tactic also, but still, they wouldn't go to that extent. So, how can I get the exposure for John's case? Well, since Serial, the absolute best way, in my opinion, is via a podcast. An explosion in the numbers of true crime podcasts has been extraordinary. And whilst many of those focus on an analysis of a case that has been concluded or look at broader topical issues, some, as you know, focus on helping those charged with or convicted of crimes. Shows like Bob's. Serial created a greater, almost general public awareness of the concept of wrongful convictions, even though those operating in the wrongful conviction sphere have been doing so for a very, very long time. Reuben the Hurricane Carter had his case immortalised in a fantastic film, and the work undertaken by Innocence Projects around the world has been going on for many, many years, long before Serial. And now we have our publicity channel. We have our way of getting our message about John out there. And with the audiences hanging on every word of some of these podcast presenters and believing every single word they utter, it can be very, very effective. As you know, these podcasts don't operate under the same rules as traditional media outlets. They are mostly not subjected to any form of regulation or oversight, or even an industry-wide code. So they represent an ideal platform for me to distribute my stories about John and my claims of his unjust treatment. In fact, because I would be sharing them with large groups of people who are already sold on the notion of systemic corruption in the justice system, and a conspiracy that runs from the very ground, the first responder at a crime scene, for example, to the very top levels, the Supreme Court justices, I don't need facts to make my claims, and they will be accepted by large numbers of people. It's ideal, really. A ready-made audience with which I can share my views and attract funds for John. And what is the problem? They're just little white lies, right? It's just a means to an end. It's simply creating a level playing field for John. No. See, this isn't a victimless crime. This isn't in any way a better type of fraud. This isn't a justifiable fleecing of people, taking advantage of their carefully manipulated views of the justice system and law enforcement. It is fraud. It is the manipulation of a system in an almost identical way to that which they scream they are trying to fix. It's launching attacks against individuals in the name of entertainment. Attacks that can have absolutely devastating consequences for the person bearing the brunt of the anger from these groups. And believe me, these groups of people, operating in a mob-like mentality, can be absolutely relentless. And I know, because I've been on the receiving end for operating this podcast. I shared with you how my high school friends were contacted, how my high school teachers, including a sports coach, were contacted by Bob's followers. And they are just the things that I've shared with you. There's so much that I haven't. There are the direct messages, the dozens and dozens of direct messages that hurl insults at me, that threaten me, and comments that criticize everything from the way I talk to the quality of our audio to the way I interact with people. There have been claims that I don't exist, and claims that if I do exist, I'm young, single, and leading a sad and lonely existence in some basement somewhere. Now, I'm reasonably thick-skinned, and none of these comments impact on me. But imagine someone already vulnerable or already burdened with serious self-doubt. Imagine the truly horrifying consequences from these attacks. It's just unthinkable. And not people that willingly open themselves up for this criticism. We're talking about experts and professionals who have offered their skills in helping the broader justice system function effectively. Now, as many of you know, we started Truth is Justice to correct misleading statements made by shows like Bob's. And if you've listened to our earlier episodes, you'll know that there is so much material for us to work with. Every single episode. And that's just Bob's show. And what impact have we had so far? Now, I think it's been far more effective than we ever thought it would be. We said that if we were able to show just one person that many of the statements made by Bob were false and misleading, then we would have achieved our goal. Well, rewardingly, we've done so much more than that. But of significant concern is the fact that despite our raising all of the lies, all of the manipulation of the facts, all of the false misleading statements, many people still fail to believe that they were lies. They don't believe that a statement made was false and misleading, even when proof is given. Now, they're so convinced of the story and the publicly stated purpose of the show that they instead then just attack us. That is why the approach I suggested with John's case is so effective, because even if the truth comes out, it really doesn't matter. Not many people will believe that version of the truth anyway. And my lies and false claims for John have become fact for many. Now, people have even excused errors or false and misleading statements in various ways, such as that that's the way that Bob does things and you have no right to question him. And look at all of the great things he has achieved. He's allowed to throw in a statement that is a little off every now and then. Now, some of you will argue at this point that people like Bob have checks and balances in place to make sure they are not presenting a case like John's, with lies and manipulation. Some will argue that Bob conducts an exhaustive analysis of a case before he chooses to take it on and present the case to his audience. But that simply isn't the case a lot of the time, and it certainly wasn't the case in the matter of Jim's murder. And Bob acknowledged that he didn't have significant parts of the case material. He acknowledged, when asked by a listener how he could possibly conduct an investigation of the case without the vast majority of the case material. And Bob's response was that the case was locked and loaded and that he had no plan B. So, in reality, you can't make the assumption that Bob was well prepared for the case based on the material. He may have been well prepared for the case and developed an opinion of Sandra's innocence based on talks with family and friends. And remember, he began using the hashtag #FreeSandy at the commencement of his coverage of this case. But really, if the assessment is completed based on friends and family of the convicted, that really isn't much of a hurdle. So the big question is this: what can be done to change this? Or does it need to change? If you're of the view that nothing needs to change, that it is fine to take the approach I've described to help John, then of course, you're absolutely free to have that view. But you should be aware that the cases you are supporting and the money you are offering is not necessarily for the reasons you believe it to be. It isn't necessarily focused on the right things. Yes, it's about acquittal, but don't be fooled into thinking that every case is a wrongful conviction. You may be helping support someone who is actually guilty of the crime. Now, you might be of the view that it needs to change. That changing it helps ensure that not only the right cases get exposure, but it ensures the people who see an opportunity for John are required to go about it in the right way, an ethical, legal and morally sound way. That they shouldn't be allowed to manipulate or game the system to get the upper hand whilst defrauding people. My strong view is that it is time that those operating in this field, the true crime realm, specifically those advocating for individuals like Bob is doing with Sandra Melgar, it's well and truly time that they consider operating under a binding code of conduct, something that brings them more in line with the operating standards of traditional media, something that brings with it credibility. Now, we've seen how powerful some of these shows can be with respect to the actions of fellow podcasters. In the recent Sword and Scale matter, for example. And it was interesting to watch the number of podcast presenters, including Bob, that jumped up to support the host, Wondery, in the actions they took against that operation. Interestingly though, no other podcasts up until now with our efforts have been bothered. Well, no one's been able to effectively and publicly raise any concerns about some of the quite extraordinary claims that have been made by Bob. And they range from comments directed at detectives, such as the "F.U. Carazol," which not only was spoken by Bob, but then went on to be parroted by many of the pages associated with his show, to the comments directed at CSI, the "My Boy Maurice" comments, the sarcastic "Thanks a lot Maurice," which turned into memes, the mention that Mr. Carpenter's lack of photographs of the back door was a little suspicious, and yes, that's the words Bob used, a little suspicious, and to say that his report, the CSI report, was intentionally misleading, and encouraging listeners to conduct private investigations into people like myself, when clearly that has absolutely nothing to do with getting any closer to understanding the underlying case. Now, there's been an absence of any other podcast seeing anything wrong with those claims. Again, would you see a Houston Chronicle headline of any of those statements made by Bob? No, of course you wouldn't. So this is my challenge of sorts to operators of podcasts like Bob's. Work with some others in developing and then committing to a binding code of conduct, a code of ethics and standards, something that governs your activities and ensures that, in referring back to my example, people connected with John are not able to manipulate the system, and that verbal attacks and bullying of individuals, which is so often encouraged by these shows, can stop. I think it would be wonderful to reach a point where shows like ours are not necessary, where there simply isn't any false and misleading statements to correct, or they are so few and far between that it is inconsequential. Because that would not only lift the professionalism of many of these operations, it would increase their credibility and result in a huge increase to their overall effectiveness. Now, where to start? Well, the Radio Television Digital News Association, and if you want to check out their website, search RTDNA, has some foundations upon which a code could be developed. Now, I don't know how this episode is going to be received. There'll be likely laughs from some groups and dismissive statements from others. Now, if you're a member of one of the groups that might mock this, think about what that actually says about the shows you support. If it takes hurling insults at detectives, making wildly speculative, entirely unsubstantiated and entirely false claims about prosecutors, jury members, experts, professionals and law enforcement officers, if it takes that to make a point and prove someone's innocence, then I think you'll very quickly arrive at the view, or you should arrive at the view if you look at it reasonably, that there is nothing more to it than a complex game of smoke and mirrors, and an intention to deceive for the purposes of financial gain, without any consideration of the consequences. And next week, we'll continue our focus on correcting the false and misleading statements, and we look forward to you joining us then. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight.
Thank you.